Me now is Father Frank Brennan, Rector of the Newman College in Melbourne, also a member of the Ruddock panel on the Religious Freedom Review. Father Frank, thanks so much for your time. One of the challenges central to this debate is legislating the ongoing permission and laws around single-sex schools, but still protecting transgender students. Is that possible? Is it achievable?
Well, that's one of the questions now before us, Kieran. It wasn't so much a question back in 2018 when we had the Ruddock Review, and clearly it was much less a question back in 2013 when Mark Dreyfus, as the Attorney General in the then Labor government, introduced the amendments to the Sex Discrimination Act, which have left the ambiguity about this sort of issue. I think there seems to be common ground politically that we don't want schools, whether public or religious, discriminating against students on the basis of their sexuality or their gender. And I think that's now pretty clear in relation to gay students. I would imagine for educationalists there'll be an outstanding question now where we still do have some single-sex schools in Australia. In Sydney yesterday I drove past the Sydney Boys High School. Now, what do we do in relation to transgender students in single-sex schools, and does that have to be dealt with specifically in the Sex Discrimination Act? That will be a live question. But I noticed that Mark Dreyfus this afternoon in his press release has indicated to the government that they're open to sensible amendments to the sex discrimination legislation as well as the religious discrimination legislation, while at the same time saying you wouldn't want to ram through things that are complex but refer them to the Law Reform Commission. So I think there are two steps that we now have. First, what are the sensible amendments that can be made to the religious discrimination bill so that it can be passed during the life of this Parliament? Second, what are the remaining complex issues that need to be considered by the Australian Law Reform Commission, given that both sides of Parliament now think there is a job for the Law Reform Commission to do?
Father Frank, what do you say to the critique from Dominic Perrottet, among others? He says that he doesn't believe legislation in this space is necessary, but others who have made the point that they argue this is a solution searching for a problem. What do you say to that sort of assessment?
I've always said it's a small problem in Australia, but it's a significant problem. And from what we've heard from politicians like Julian Leeser, for example, that in the Jewish community it's a growing problem. We've heard that in the Muslim community it's a growing problem. It's interesting that Mr Perrottet should say that, because the Ruddock Review found that New South Wales was almost a unique state jurisdiction in not having provided for religious discrimination laws. So New South Wales does need legislation of that sort. And yes, at a Commonwealth level, given that we don't have a National Human Rights Act, what we've always done is enact anti-discrimination laws so as to be faithful to our international obligations. Everyone concedes that in theory, religious discrimination has been the one great lacuna. Now, it doesn't mean a lot of practical problems for most of us from day to day. It's more been an issue of, is this something that we can practically fix now without creating further problems?
We're at the 11th hour of this Parliament, Father Frank. It is a complex area, no doubt, and we're facing possibly a few days of certainly emotional, very high-stakes debate around this. Not ideal, is it, on the eve of an election to be managing such a complex and sensitive piece of legislation?
Not ideal at all, and let's bear in mind the very emotional issues were heightened at the time of the Wentworth by-election in 2018. They were once again very emotional at the time the Parliament was sitting at Christmas 2018. It was all going to be fixed before the last election, and it's all going to be fixed before this election. So I think all of our politicians on both sides have to admit that they haven't handled this very well. I think there is, though, emerging common ground, Kieran. I think there's now a clear understanding that it is not appropriate, even for the most fundamentalist conservative religious group, to run a school which would discriminate adversely against gay students or transgender students. I think there's also common ground now, despite Victoria's recent legislation on this, which falls lamentably short. But there is common ground to acknowledge that, yes, religious schools should be able to choose teachers, not on the basis of gender or whatever, but on the basis that they get the message, that they're on board with the mission of the school. In exactly the same way as politicians can employ people in their electorate offices or their ministerial offices, people who get the mission. So I think those sorts of things are now clear, and what's now necessary is for some common sense between our elected leaders to ensure that common sense amendments are made. I think part the problem has been that the Morrison government has engaged in a backdoor consultation process which has been aimed at getting on board some of the more conservative religious groups, where they wanted a Religious Freedom Act rather than just a Religious Discrimination Act. Well, on the Ruddock Committee we always said, look, you're not going to get a Religious Freedom Act. The most you can hope for is a lean, clean religious discrimination bill. Now, our Parliament should be able to do that, and they should then be able to say, well, look, these are the outstanding issues with the Sex Discrimination Act that require further consideration by the Law Reform Commission. And I think everyone should listen to Mark Dreyfus on that, because he was the Attorney-General who introduced the amendments in 2013, which have now proved problematic. So he knows you can't just ram these things through the Parliament with all sorts of compromises. You've got to make sure you get the balance right.
And these debates are often done at the parliamentary level, with political parties making statements and major organisations putting their views to them as part of that process. But every now and then that debate is punctured by a very personal account of one or a few individuals, like we saw with Stephen Jones, a very emotional and forceful speech to the House of Representatives.
Yes, and I had a woman write to me on my Facebook page this morning, a Catholic teacher with a transgender child, saying, what can I possibly say to my child? And if you pardon a bit of religious language on your program, I, as a Christian, I say to her child, look, doesn't matter what your sexual orientation or gender, you are created in the image and likeness of God. You are a temple of the Holy Spirit. We are committed to your educational well-being, creating a situation where your full human flourishing can be achieved. Now, the real question, Kieran, is how educationally is that best to be done? Now, there will be complexities, for example, in single-sex schools where a student says that they are now transgender. There'll be some schools who will be able to deal with that in terms of incorporation of the child. There are other schools for whom you'd say, well, that's not the best educational environment for that child. Let's put the well-being of children first in these instances and not just play the politics.
Father Frank Brennan, it's really great to get your insights as always. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be with you.